What's up, Alex? How's it going?
Doing well. Hold on one second.
All right, I guess while Alex is getting set up, I'll
Yeah,
introduce the space, and I
I'm
know
here,
that
by the
we
way.
have
Thanks
a
for
couple
having me, man.
folks jumping on. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you got set up as a co-host. So I know we're waiting for Matt and Sarah to join us, but we are going to be reviewing Alex's most recent contribution to Bitcoin Magazine, an insanely in-depth and well-researched article, "The Inevitable Cost of War in the Age of Quantitative Easing." We're going to have, again, a lot of commentary about the article itself, but it's pinned to the top. Really encourage everyone to check it out. It is amongst Alex's amazing series with Bitcoin Magazine, diving into so many other aspects of what's happening in the Bitcoin revolution, around Bitcoin and throughout history. So this was an amazing addition to that. I know Alex put in a lot of hours researching and a lot of books, but it's our honor to host it here. Want to encourage everyone to come meet Alex and say what's up to Alex at the Bitcoin conference at the beginning of next month, April 6th through the 9th. That is going to be in Miami Beach. So really excited for that to be going down. Really excited to see all the amazing things that Alex and HRF are going to be doing there as well. So make sure to go to b.tc/conference and get your ticket now before tickets prices go up, and come to the ultimate Bitcoin gathering, 30,000 Bitcoiners strong. So with all of that, I know we have both of our guests. Alex, I'm going to hand it off to you, sir.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bitcoin Mag team, for allowing us to do this. I think it's a very important topic. I'm really, really happy Sarah could be here. Also, Matthew Pines has been kind enough to join us to help with some of the commentary. This is a topic I started looking at a long time ago before Russia invaded Ukraine. So we're definitely going to touch on that. We're going to talk about Putin a little bit. We're going to talk about, how dictators wage war a little bit. But my interest was essentially in the connection between money and finance and kind of like how wars were waged. And I read two books a few months ago that really kind of piqued my interest in this. First is this book called Taxing Wars by Sarah Krebs, who's here with us today, who I will introduce in a second, called The American Way of War Finance and the Decline of Democracy. And then the second book was this book by a journalist named Christopher Leonard, called The Lords of Easy Money. And as I was reading these two books, a really clear overlap struck me that it's not just that we've changed the way we pay for wars as Americans over time, but also that we've changed the way that we do our monetary policy in a way that it reduces the government cost to borrow. And this was like something I just couldn't stop thinking about. So I ended up spending several months researching and writing about it and interviewing a lot of people in the space. And what we're gonna start here with I really want Sarah to talk about her book and why she wrote it. She's a veteran herself of the armed forces, and I think she has an amazing perspective on this. And we're going to talk about some ways forward. But to me, what I just can't get out of my mind is like this idea of like government bond market intervention and like what it means for like for these like what we call forever wars in the United States. These wars that the average person doesn't know much about, that the government conducts, totally undemocratically. But both of course from the average person's point of view, but even from Congress's point of view. So we'll talk about stuff like Operation Inherent Resolve, and look, again, we'll keep an eye on Ukraine. There is a lot of public polling out there showing now that Americans do support action there. We can unpack that, but a lot of what I think we're going to talk about is the way that these polls question Americans, because the polls say, do you support action, not are you willing to pay for action? And that's just a massive difference. So with that, I think I'll ask Sarah to come off mute if she can, and just tell us about yourself, Sarah, and why you wrote this book. And I'll go on mute, and I'll come back and ask you a couple questions afterwards.
Great. Well, the piece you wrote is incredible, and it was an amazing deep dive into this topic that I think is otherwise a little bit arcane, which is the connection between war finance and the way we conduct these wars. One quick kind of parenthetical on those polls we've been seeing about Ukraine. So there's a really striking percentage of Americans that support a no-fly zone. And the way those questions are asked is always, I think, pretty leading. Do you support a no-fly zone around and in Ukraine? And 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans say they support that. They have no idea what that means. They have no idea what it means if a Russian plane is in that airspace and that we have to shoot it down. So I think there's a lot that Americans don't know about the way we fight our wars. And my thesis was that a big part of that has to do with these shrouded costs of war. And so just taking a step back even more, I thought about this because a colleague of mine was looking at security taxes that the Costa Rican government had collected to support, and the Colombian government in South America to fight against in these civil conflicts that were going on. And I thought about the US wars and was remarking to myself, as someone who had written a book on post Cold War military interventions, and as you said, served in those interventions. We haven't done anything like that. And then I was curious, have we ever done that? And what was striking is that we, until Vietnam, had always had these wars that were financed through war taxes. And so what I do as in my day-to-day job is I teach political science, and I work and do research at the intersection of tech and policy. And so I was really curious to look into this and see what precipitated this change. And looking, as you do a great job at engaging with in your piece about democratic peace theory, says that what makes a democracy different is that the costs of war in blood and treasure are passed along to the public. And when the public no longer thinks that there's a payoff in terms of what they're sacrificing and what they're getting out of the war, then they'll put pressure on leaders to bring those wars to a close. And I started thinking, well, if you have stopped passing along those costs in treasure because they're not paying war taxes, suddenly there's that whole mechanism of accountability unravels. So I'll just pause there and maybe see if that makes sense and where we want to go from there.
Yeah, well, I'd love for you to just talk about, and we can break this down, but World War I, II, and Vietnam and Korea, and talk about kind of how we used to pay for wars. And we can, certainly think about two things. We can think about the fact that, as I quoted in my piece, the taxation state was really being built, right? The modern taxation state was really being built in the 20th century. And, rough estimates are that about 30% of World War I was paid with taxes, half of World War II, and 100% of Korea. And then these taxes that LBJ tried to raise in 67, coming into effect in 68, really led to arguably, one of the reasons why he decided not to run for another term. And, just the shocking fact that we haven't paid for any more war taxes since then. And then on the other side would be war-specific financing. So bonds that you as an American pay for knowing it's going to go to war, as opposed to knowing it's going to go to like general borrowing. So these used to be a huge thing. And I just would say one fact before I turn it back over to you is that World War II, 85 million Americans bought war bonds. So that was half the population. And they bought these bonds to the equivalent of $3 trillion in today's dollars. So if you think about the fact that that's half of our annual fiscal budget for this year, $6 trillion. So Americans bought the equivalent of half of 2022, all federal spending, personally and through their individuals and families and businesses through World War II. I mean, what a massive contribution of treasure. And just this whole theme about Americans did used to be very connected to war making, and now are not. But would love to hear some of the history that you looked at in the book.
Yeah. So again, I have really great students at Cornell, but you, I think, have done a more careful reading than most of my students on this. So I really appreciate that you've done such careful homework. So yeah, this goes back quite some time. I mean, so if you think back to the 1790s, Whiskey Rebellion was initiated and mobilized because the US had fought the Revolutionary War and had debts they had to repay. So this was the basis of our independence, that we had fought a war, we were now in debt, and we needed to recoup those, we needed to pay for those debts. And so the whiskey tax was levied, and there was a rebellion over it. So, and I think one of the things that you see again that is embedded in this democratic peace theory is the idea that taxes are not popular. And people feel that connection between what they're paying out of pocket and this conflict that the government is conducting. So then you have in 1798, there's a prospect of the quasi-war with France. And so they initiate, prior to the onset of war, they initiate a war tax to pay for the war. Well, what do you think that does? That precipitates a debate about the merits of that war. And so you can go through these wars that the U.S. fought over time and see that the ones where, as you say in your article, the hide and seek wars that weren't popular. So the War of 1812, we think of this as kind of, well, the U.S. wins this war. It was not a popular war. And so for as long as the U.S. could hold off initiating a war tax, it did, because the leaders knew that this would make the war more unpopular. But they reached a point where they could not introduce this tax because they couldn't pay for it. And so, and another thing you get at in the article is that the U.S. has really had a luxury in recent years of being able to borrow, because it has been the world's reserve currency. Most countries, and I mentioned Costa Rica and Colombia at the outset, don't have that luxury. So they have to think about wars before they initiate them or engage in them, because they have to think about how they're going to pay for things. So the U.S. had generally engaged in that practice of financing their wars along the way, pay as you go, as Truman had put it in the Korean War. But largely these were through excise taxes, because there wasn't even, the U.S. was, it was the 16th Amendment in 1913 that was passed that allowed it to, that made it constitutional to even have an income tax. So the U.S. then introduces a series of taxes in World War I to pay for that war. And what I want to talk about these big world wars and World War II, that was really notable to me in my research. I went to the Roosevelt Library in outside New York City, and so I read through papers. I read through letters of constituents and unions and teachers that were paying these war taxes. And we think about and sort of how that was connecting the president to the war he was conducting abroad. And so we think about World War II as an uncontroversial war, but reading these letters and the kind of contact that these taxes brought between the individuals and these wars made it really patently obvious to me that hearing from constituents that were bearing that burden really created an accountability linkage at the highest levels, and that was really instrumental in sort of forcing this rethink year to year, if not day to day. Why are we fighting this war? Why are we fighting this war? And so we get to the Korean War, and this, by this point, is pretty institutionalized. You have a war, you introduce this war tax. And Truman, and so as you, I think, mentioned, 100% of this war was financed through war taxes. But he gets to 1952, and he's in this kind of in a stalemated war. Now it's unpopular. He's trying to introduce another war tax, and there's an election. And so this is something, he's labeled high tax Harry, and it becomes a political dead end for him. And so then we get to the Vietnam War, really unpopular war. And Johnson is being told by his economic advisors, look, we have high inflation, which is maybe seeming like it's foreshadowing where we are today. High inflation, when you have high inflation, traditionally the sort of antidote to this was to introduce taxes because it dampens spending. So he puts this off as long as he can because this has been this process of gradual escalation in Vietnam that he's intentionally tried to increase troops without there being real domestic debate about it. Well, again, think about what we've been talking about so far. When you introduce taxes, people start noticing, and it forces debate. And that was exactly what Johnson was trying to avoid. And so after that, it sets this clear connection that we should have understood, which we understood theoretically. The democratic peace theory tells us will bring this clear connection between people and war. Well, leaders who are engaging in conflicts that are unpopular don't want that connection. And so thereafter, there were no war taxes to pay for the wars that we've been fighting for the last several decades.
And I just want to point out that you quoted some very famous thinkers from history in your work, as did others who I quoted in my essay, whether it be John Stuart Mill or Adam Smith or even Keynes himself. And they basically said, look, governments shouldn't borrow for war, but if they do, they should definitely pair it with taxes, and they should not allow the interest rate to rise. So this brings us to today, where all of America's post 9/11 wars, where we've spent, more than $2 trillion, and we've spent more than $1 trillion on interest payments alone, which to me was like super shocking to learn. We've figured out a way using our reserve currency status to pay for these wars without any taxes. In fact, there were tax cuts both during the 80s military buildup under Reagan and then again in 2001 and in 2003 under Bush, under W. So number one, we figured out a way to pay for them without taxes, without raising taxes, and without the interest rate rising, because we've had this confluence of basically the later stages of a reserve currency where there's just incredible demand from the world for our debt, which was a system that we set up and designed through the decades, and now amazing, staggering government intervention in the bond market. And I just have some numbers that I shared. I mean, so the U.S. government, since the great financial crisis, which of course coincided with the peak of the Iraq War in 2007 and 8, has bought $8.9 trillion of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. And since March of 2020, when we had the coronavirus kind of stock market crash, the government has bought $4.7 million of securities per minute. So wow. It's involved in this staggering effort to put downward pressure on yields of government debt to make it easier to borrow for war. And my big question, of course, in exploring this was looking at your work, looking at how you saw democratic peace theory potentially having this flaw in it with regard to how leaders in the post, let's say, 71 era were able to basically figure out ways to pay for war without the public noticing. And then kind of pairing that with what I'm seeing in the bond markets here, and just looking at this quantitative easing, zero interest rate policy stuff. And it's global. I mean, I was in a conversation with an economist the other day, Sarah, who said we were looking at how the German government's gonna allocate 100 billion euros for this to support Ukraine, right? And I asked him, do you know how they're financing that? And are there going to be any taxes? And he said, almost certainly not. And I said, don't you think that's important? And he basically said, who cares? And that's kind of where we are. And I don't know, would love to just get your reaction to that.
Yeah, I mean, so of course it completely resonates. And so this is something I would hear over and over, whether I was talking to people in the Israeli Defense Force or in Denmark, that no one wants to make these hard choices. And it is sort of a position of privilege, given the role of these economies in the international financial system, that they can just kind of, it's like a subterfuge, they keep engaging in these policies. No one's really asking the hard questions. And that's where I want to, I guess, come back to the politics of this, because we think of these as economic choices. But I think there's a real kind of political coalition story to this, which is, and it gets at 2009, actually. So a member of Congress, David Obey, had introduced a series of war taxes. And actually, so he was in a coalition with John Murtha from Pennsylvania, and Charlie Rangel from New York. It might not be a coincidence that none of them are in office anymore because they were doing what no one else wanted to do, which was introduce a way to pay for the wars that we were fighting. And so you mentioned the Iraq War, but let's not forget the Afghanistan surge that came soon after that. And so what was interesting about that discussion about there was some discussion about how to pay for the Afghanistan surge that was completely mostly detached from the military mission, which was that Obama had said that he wanted a number that would basically coincide with us. He didn't want it to cost $1 trillion because the public he felt like that number, I think he even said that a number that started with a T wasn't going to work well politically. So he gets the troop number down to a level that will be commensurate with a budget that is less than starting with a T trillion. And so, but meanwhile, we're increasing troops, 30,000 troops. And so these members of Congress try to introduce a set of bills that they label something along the lines of the Share the Sacrifice Act. And so they're Democrats in office, and their own member of Congress, who was then Nancy Pelosi, is still there, says when she's asked about this legislation, do you support this? And she completely distanced herself from this. And I think the reason this comes back to these political coalitions, no one really wants to be associated with introducing any taxes, certainly not a war tax. And so the grand compromise then was that the Republicans would get their money for the war and the Democrats would get their money for social programs. And I think that's where we are today, which is that that the grand coalition, the grand bargain, where both sides are getting what they want, but only because you're adding to the debt. And this gets to something that you mentioned very early on that I don't think I talked about, but is important, that when you think about the debt, what makes that less of a political liability in terms of how we fight a war is that the war itself is just kind of one contribution among many to the debt, whereas a war tax is explicitly connected to the war. So people will say they're not very happy with the debt or the deficit, but there's not that connection between the debt and the war itself. And then, both sides can then kind of blame it on each other. And I think we saw this, I remember Paul Ryan, when he was the Speaker of the House, and John Boehner, they said they had wanted to reduce the debt. Donald Trump said he wanted to reduce the debt. And then that never happens because it's neither side's interest to cut programs or cut defense spending, because there is a political constituency behind each one of those. And then the way they compromise this is just to add everything, aggregate it all.
Yo, what is going on, plebs? We're going to take a break from our programming to tell you about the resurrection of our print magazine, starting with the El Salvador issue. Starting this fall, Bitcoin Magazine will be available on newsstands nationwide and at retail stores such as Barnes and Noble. Don't want to get off your couch, though? No problem. You can also go to store.bitcoinmagazine.com. So skip the line and get each issue shipped directly to your front door with our annual subscription. I'm talking 4 issues a year that contain exclusive interviews and profiles with leading Bitcoiners, actionable insights on the state of the market, breaking news and cultural trends, along with powerful photos and artwork from the best artists in the world. Subscribe today and get 21% off using code podcast at checkout. That's PODCAST, podcast at checkout.
So I want to get Matthew's comments here. Just a couple more things. Pearl Harbor, massive, massive change in terms of American sentiment towards the war and towards actually contributing not just the people and their personal selves, but also the taxes and the Liberty bonds. That's correct, right? Like pre Pearl Harbor, post Pearl Harbor, right?
Well, yeah, I guess Pearl Harbor is definitely a watershed, but even still, and again, I'm coming back to the archival material I saw from the 1942, 1943, when we're still kind of in the real kind of heart of the war. And it's not as though the American public gives this blank check to the government to go fight. I mean, if you think about all the machinery, the propaganda machinery that was behind, the Disney cartoons about what is it, like, fight the axis, pay your taxes. The way that we had to really mobilize the public to do something that wasn't instinctive or innate, because and if you think about coming off the Great Depression of the 1930s, the idea that people would hand over money for bonds, for these liberty bonds, that's why they were called liberty bonds, is to try to create this positive association between kind of freedom and the fiscal sacrifice. But it's not, and this is of course the whole point, is that this is kind of the least, and I think this is something that everyone from Adam Smith to Keynes has said, that this is the least natural thing to hand over your money that you've worked for to the government, and the only way to be able to sort of make that work is if the public feels like it's getting something out of. And so that, I think, did require, even after Pearl Harbor, considerable effort on the part of the government to and again, to kind of keep the momentum going on the war and make it really clear why that sacrifice was worth it.
Yeah, so for everybody who's new here, I'm talking with Sarah Krebs, who's Air Force veteran, author of the book Taxing Wars. We're talking about how from 1900 to 1960 to the 1960s, more or less, the United States government paid for wars in a dialogue with its people through taxes, where people knew that they were contributing, as well as through war bonds. The fact I dropped earlier was that 85 million Americans bought war bonds during World War II, totaling about $3 trillion in today's dollars. So, Americans were very involved with war fighting, and they debated it, and they knew that it was happening. And today, all the post 9/11 wars, they don't know that they're happening. Most people, including me, didn't even know about Operation Inherent Resolve, which is an 8-year war that's cost tens of billions of dollars. All the post 9/11 wars have been paid for by borrowing. They're called credit card wars. And we're just talking about how this is sort of damaging to our democracy. I want to bring Matthew Pines in here. But I'll just leave it at this to set you up, Matthew. There's now rumblings of talking about yield curve control, which was something the U.S. government did in World War II, along with raising taxes and along with Liberty bonds, in order to keep the cost of borrowing low. So it's kind of interesting that we're kind of back in this 1940s moment. And I do want to talk about where do we go from here. And there's kind of, as I lay out in my paper, I think there's three possible ways we could go. But would love to get Matthew's, just maybe you introduce yourself, and you were very helpful in helping me with my essay, Matthew, and just giving your general commentary on the subject would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and appreciate you inviting up to speak. And Sarah, really appreciate that. That commentary is really informative. Yeah, so I've been supporting. I've been a management consultant for a number of years, supporting the government on kind of security issues. But more recently, I've become involved with the Bitcoin Policy Institute, where I've been really taking a more serious look at Bitcoin and national security. So we're going to be having a few products coming out in the near future to kind of take a serious look at that question. So be on the lookout for some of those things shortly. But specific to your essay and the topic today, one of the things that I would note is the terminology we use is very revealing, right? And I think you noted this in your essay, that we switched from calling the Pentagon essentially a War Department to a Defense Department. And that kind of semantic evolution, I think, mirrored the sort of financing changes over time, how we support these things. And if you look at the Defense Department budget, nowadays, you'll see a number of different sort of line items that sort of are ambiguously termed. So, for example, like, we have the base budget, which goes to things like operations and maintenance and personnel and R&D. Those are actually where the biggest kind of dollars are appropriated, is to sort of kind of keep the Defense Department running, invest in new platforms, and support the massive kind of human costs associated with training and paying for health insurance and veterans benefits, et cetera. And so, like, the war component of the budget is sort of stuffed into things called the Overseas Contingency Operations Funding, and very kind of anodyne terminology, right? And Overseas Contingency Operations, OCO, and that is where things for specific combat operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, et cetera, are often appropriated. And there's also another bucket of like emergency appropriations that they'll also throw in. But within OCO, you'll see splits between quote direct war costs, which are normally the things you would think of like, well, that's what we really care about is like, what are we paying for war? And those are often like the smallest dollar figures, right? Because they don't want to put too much money up against like a thing that says direct war costs. But those are sort of itemized as like specifically associated with combat or direct combat support costs that will not continue to be expended once those combat operations end at those quote major contingency locations. But then the larger usually buckets are for enduring and base requirements for those contingency operations. So that's like the first technical point of just when you look at the Defense Department budget, it's very difficult and sort of, I think, intentionally so, how they obscure where we appropriate funds for which types of activities. And I think to your point, right, like war making and war financing is sort of a strategic level question, but when it's all roped into just sort of annual appropriations for sort of these enduring conflicts, it becomes very difficult for the public to understand how
Matthew, let me just
add, go ahead.
That's a great point. Let me just add also the bonds piece. Like these used to be called Liberty bonds, obviously euphemism, but or war bonds specifically. But then they became Series E bonds. Then they became Series EE bonds. They basically got phased out. There was a very limited Patriot bond actually from 2001 to 2011. I wasn't able to find data on how much were actually sold, but they're obviously a minute portion of the overall cost of that war. But the fact is that today the borrowing that's done for these wars that comes from the private sector and from the people is completely hidden in terms of whether it's war related or not. Like when you're trading a 2-year US bond on Wall Street, you have no idea whether or not it was the spending went to war or not. And this has allowed just this massive increase in this area of borrowing. And I just kind of wondered in the essay, like, if bonds that went to war were raised specifically for that purpose and were labeled as such these days, which one could argue would be healthy for our country, would they, where would they be trading? Would they trade at a discount? Would they be ESG compliant? Like, I just had all these questions. And, the fact is we're never going to have to deal with those questions because sadly, the government's not interested in telling you which borrowing is going to go towards blowing people up or whatever, or not. It's just frustrating. But anyway, Matthew, go ahead.
Yeah, no. And I think, that was actually going to be my second point, which is sort of zooming out from like the technical sort of domestic appropriations game of how we finance defense spending and associated kind of combat operations, is through treasury auctions, right? And then it's like, okay, well, who are the buyers of those bonds at those auctions and how has that evolved over time? And I think that's an interesting kind of macro kind of strategic point that we're now kind of confronting, in the past few years is, and I won't go through the full history, I think you summarized it to a certain extent in your essay, but one of the things that happened over the, in the sort of the post-1971 kind of dollar system where we had sort of free floating exchange rates. And so the dollar was not backed by a kind of a gold convertibility, but was backed by full faith and credit. But really it was the fact that to purchase oil in the global market was denominated in dollars. And then there was an associated explosion of sort of offshore dollar denominated loans that became kind of the coin of the realm for international trade and derivatives and overall kind of international financing. And U.S. Treasuries kind of became the foundational collateral, that kind of quote unquote safe and liquid asset that everyone had to hold, whether you're a hedge fund, whether you're a bank, whether you're a foreign government. If you wanted to participate in this global petrodollar system, an emerging kind of eurodollar system, you had to hold U.S. Treasuries essentially, on your balance sheet in order to play in the global system. And so that kind of set up, that was kind of like the running backstory for U.S. Kind of geopolitical and foreign affairs since the 70s was essentially how to keep the Treasury market kind of in that position so that there was no challenge to the status of the Treasury at that sort of the foundation of the global dollar system. And every time there was a little bit of a hiccup, we sort of found a way to kind of create new buyers, right? And I won't go through the whole history, but one of the most important new buyers that we locked into that system was China in 2001, where we made them we sort of thought we could bring them into the international system through the WTO. And we set up this kind of really, quote unquote, mutually beneficial arrangement, kind of dollar trade recycling mechanism where we would buy all of the goods from the factories that they were now building that essentially were cheaper labor than existed in, say, Mexico after NAFTA, and help them kind of industrialize and grow their wealth, bring people from the countryside to the cities, and they would export their goods to us. We would pay for those with dollars. Those dollars would accumulate in China, and those dollars that accumulate in China, China would recirculate and essentially recycle into U.S. treasuries. And so we were able to essentially continuously finance our deficits after 2001 as China kind of became fully embedded in this sort of global dollar recycling
and just
system.
Matthew, just to pause you for a second, for the room. I've done a bunch of writing on this in my previous essays as well, but it's worth noting that yes, of course, like through many different instances and events and trends, the US dollar became, as Matthew said, the currency of the realm, and it's what people want. It's like the most quote unquote risk-free thing, especially US treasuries. But that was helped along by like non-market activity. So in the late 60s, Johnson actually called the Germans. There's like readouts of this, and basically threatened them that if they didn't buy our debt, like we would like move our troops. Like this is something that actually happened. In the 70s, of course, you had the deal between Kissinger and Nixon and the Saudis, where we would protect them and sell them tons of weapons in exchange for them pricing oil in dollars and recycling their dollar profits back into U.S. debt. That's the petrodollar system. And then when they went broke in the 80s, when the oil price cratered, we moved over to Japan, the world's second largest economy. And through the Plaza Accords and other international events, we kind of forced them to buy a lot of our debt. And then, as Matthew said, eventually China became the biggest and most recent giant buyer. But yeah, as I think Matthew's also pointed out, like basically since the great financial crisis, you had this decade where, like, for example, China like quadrupled the amount of American debt it owned between like 04 and 11. And then since then, it's reduced the amount of debt it's owned. So you've had essentially foreign ownership of U.S. debt go from like 60% to 40% over the last 15 years. And this is where things get dicey. And this is one of the reasons why you have such a massive bond market government intervention from our own Federal Reserve, and why there's $9 trillion sitting on its balance sheet. Now, you maybe have Biden going to Saudi Arabia in a month, and you got to be asking yourself, why the hell is he going to Saudi Arabia? Well, I mean, one reason is if we're going to have oil prices this decade that are $150 or $200 or even just $100, they're going to have a ton of money. And, maybe he's going to try and boot up a petrodollar part 2 where they buy a ton of our debt and help us out in this regard. The national security priority of the United States is currently to keep borrowing costs as low as possible. But anyway, Matthew, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to finish up with one point that I think is worth mentioning now is, this system was designed to support, in the Cold War, at least had a nominal justification of sort of financing kind of strategic competition against, the Soviet Union. And, there was sort of nominal justification, to whatever perspective you have on that like, that allowed us to sort of outspend the Soviets, right? That was their economy just couldn't keep pace with us. And we were able to kind of use the dollar system essentially as that kind of structural advantage. And then we sort of got into this hyperpower moment in the 90s where, we weren't sure exactly what the role of the U.S. on the global stage was. And we retreated more internally, right? We sort of focused more on domestic policy with Clinton. We ran a balanced budget, weren't really focused too much on sort of international power projection as much as we were during the Cold War. And then 9/11 happened, and we sort of launched into this frenzy of kind of misadventures and sort of imperial you could call it kind of disasters in the Middle East. And during that time, since 2001, really, the sort of geopolitical state of affairs has really dramatically shifted. I mean, during the 20th century, the main objective for U.S. power was to prevent kind of a Eurasian power bloc forming between Russia and China. That's part of the reason why we peeled China off of Russia, with the Nixon trip. And as sort of Russia was sort of relatively strong and China was relatively weak. In the 90s, they were both relatively weak. Russia was destroyed and China was still just sort of barely getting out the gate. And then everything kind of switched essentially in the 2000s, where both Russia and China started getting stronger together and shifted both towards a very similar sort of authoritarian system. And you can sort of see that now, kind of those trend lines kind of converging, of kind of rising powers that are now kind of in a relative strategic alignment, that are now kind of in a position that they really weren't in really, ever, to sort of challenge this global dollar-based system and the kind of the quote-unquote rules-based international order that has been premised upon it. So that's kind of where I kind of zoom out and I look at, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is, I think, an example of at least what Putin thought he felt he had some relative strengths. It remains to be seen how it's going to play out. But like the strategic balance of power is very different than it was 20 years ago. And that manifests in the treasury market, right? And all the things the Fed has had to do since 2008. But I think now we're seeing kind of some of these long dormant or kind of long-standing, somewhat slow-moving tectonic shifts kind of fracturing. And this is where, big changes can happen.
Yeah, I want to thank you for that, Matthew. I want to hand it back over to Sarah and get her reactions. But real quick, just for the room, basically one of the mechanisms I try to describe in the article is the bond market intervention and quantitative easing, and essentially this idea that if there's kind of more demand pressure, if there's more buying of a particular bond, then the yield is going to drop and the borrowing cost of the issuer will go down. And if there's less demand for it, the yield's going to rise and the borrowing cost will go up. And I think an interesting fact here is that for every, and Lynn Alden points this out, but in her excellent work that you should all read, but basically for every 1% rate in heights, and we're currently at 0.08% Fed funds rate. The 2-year Treasury is not that much higher than that right now. But for every full 1% hike, at a budget, at a debt of 30 trillion, you're talking around $300 billion of new interest payments. So if we're to go to like 3 or 4% rates, which would be historically reasonable, 0 is certainly bizarre. We're talking, another trillion and a half dollars of spending, which starts to account for, a third or even half of our tax revenue. So that's why this is like such an important point to think about. Is our system is essentially dependent on these low rates. So before I lay out where do we go from here, Sarah, do you want to react to any of the stuff Matthew was going through? Or anything else that's comes to your mind?
I was so glad he brought up the overseas OCO, overseas contingency operations, because I think this is a really important part of the story that we hadn't touched on. And so those are controversial for the 12 people who pay attention to this, because they are essentially the emergency spending on the part of the government. And so those don't get a lot of debate. They don't get a lot of congressional oversight. They're not subjected to the Budget Control Act. And yet they tend to be a pretty sizable number, in the $100 billion a year. And those are it's the OCO that then funds operations like in Libya. And so that, I think, also contributes to this lack of debate, because it's kind of this separate part of the budget. The other thing, I think, this is a little sort of a point about, I completely agree with Matt that we saw kind of this, quote, peace dividend in the 1990s, where we see a decline in defense spending. But one really interesting point about that is that actually the spending on defense started to go up before 9/11. And I think this comes back to some of these kind of almost existential questions of why is the U.S., how does the system we have in place almost foster a bit of foreign policy meddling and recklessness? And I think that what I mean by that is everything we're talking about, these structural conditions of, funding these wars not through taxes, but through debt, and putting this on different lines that are basically inoculated from even congressional debate.
No, I mean, this is an important thing for us to discuss, and we hope the conversation here can just spawn more conversation and chatter about this.
My fellow plebs, the Bitcoin conference is back. Bitcoin 2022, April 6th through the 9th, is the ultimate pilgrimage for the Bitcoin ecosystem. The Bitcoin Conference is the biggest event in all of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. We're leveling up and making this bigger and better than ever. I'm talking straight to the moon with the 4-day long festival in the heart of Miami at the Miami Beach Convention Center. This has something for everyone. Whether you're a high-powered Bitcoin entrepreneur, a core developer, or a Bitcoin newbie, Bitcoin 2022 is the ultimate place for you to be with your people and celebrate and learn about the Bitcoin culture. So make sure to go to b.tc/conference to lock in your official tickets and use promo code Satoshi for 10% off. You want more off? Pay in Bitcoin and you'll receive $100 off general admission and $1,000 off Whale Pass. Those are stackable. So go to b.tc/conference and attend the best conference in Bitcoin history. Yo, my fellow Bitcoin lovers, have I got something specifically curated for you? The Deep Dive is Bitcoin Magazine's premium markets intelligence newsletter. This isn't some paid group shilling buy and sell signals. No, this is a premium Bitcoin analysis led by Dylan LeClaire and his team of analysts. They break down in an easily digestible way what is happening on chain, in the derivatives markets, and in the greater macro backdrop context for Bitcoin. This newsletter turns volatility into a joke. So hit up members.bitcoin.magazine.com and use promo code podcast for 30% off the deep dive. That's members.bitcoinmagazine.com, promo code podcast for 30% off. Divorce your pay group and learn why Bitcoin is the strongest asset by Dylan and LeClaire and his team.
As I said, we'd maybe briefly touch on what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, Putin has no, checks and balances against him. He could invade Ukraine. He doesn't really care what anybody else thinks. He's a dictator. He's basically got his number one opponent is in a prison. The other one's dead, and the third one is abroad. So he's gotten rid of anybody who could stop him. Democracies are supposed to be different. Like theoretically, democracies are supposed to have checks and balances on what their leaders can do. And those checks and balances have been taken away from us through monetary policy, essentially, is the argument of my essay. So that's where we are. We've heard from Sarah Krebs and Matthew Pines, who've looked at this issue at length from their own careers. That brings us to, I guess, where to go from here. In my essay, I have three kind of, and I'd love to get Sarah's thoughts on the first two for sure. And then we have a bunch of people in the room who we can get thoughts on the third piece, which I think Sarah also thinks is interesting, but of course is just seemingly learning about now, right? But so one would be higher, war taxes, new war taxes, and I think Sarah already talked about how that's been politically not feasible, but maybe we could get her to recap that. And the second one would be conscription, and also seemingly not possible. So maybe Sarah, maybe you want to unpack these two as like things that could potentially bring war making back kind of more closer to the hands of the people, but maybe explain why those two options are politically not really possible right now, or would be very unpopular.
Yeah, and just to tee up your third point, which, as you said, I think is provocative and worth considering, is when I was giving book talks a couple of years ago on this, I always sort of got to the end and felt a little bit kind of without words, because it seemed like the if you think that if one makes the argument, which I did, that the reason why we get some of this foreign policy adventurism is that the public is apathetic, and because the public is apathetic, Congress doesn't care. Well, what's the answer to that? Well, we need to reconnect the public with these wars, and the two ways to do it, coming back to our democratic peace theory, is kind of make them feel that pain in blood and treasure. And so the blood part is conscription, which is something we did away with in the 1970s as well, going to the all-volunteer force. And, the problem with reintroducing that is that there are good reasons not to have conscription, which is that you don't want people, I mean, again, having been in the military, I wouldn't want to be serving with people who were forced to be there. I don't know that they would be doing good work that I would depend on them for. And, there are also economic reasons to think that that's not a good idea. I mean, but I think that's sort of maybe a topic for another day. And then on the war taxes front, there were just political inconveniences on both sides of the aisle that made that a non-starter. And so I think we're unlikely to see war taxes either. So again, as I thought about this, I felt like I did a pretty decent job identifying the problem and the consequences, but thinking through kind of the next steps was really hard because of kind of the political environment that we have today.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I just would say that we are often left with no answer here, which is why these wars are called the forever wars. I mean, they just keep going on, and it's not clear how to really stop them. And I think most of us here think that this is a threat to our democracy and possibly to democratic peace theory. So one thing that I've been looking at a lot is the monetary standard itself, and would love to get Matthew's take on this. Obviously, he's at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, but essentially, gold was a major restraint for governments when they were fighting wars. If you read history of World War I, you'll see that governments went off the gold standard and that's how they financed those wars, and they never really went back. And whether or not you think the gold standard is good or bad is not really the point here. The point is that the gold standard was a restraint on war, and it did sort of force governments to really think hard about spending. And then the problem was they were able to go off the gold standard, and that's because they were able to demonetize gold. So and this was if you read carefully through the history leading up to Vietnam, you'll see how in America, at least, I mean, in 1933, FDR made holding gold illegal. People took their gold and exchanged it for promises to pay in the form of paper. We defaulted on our debt. The dollar was devalued. And then everybody in the world was on this dollar standard where you used US dollars, and other governments knew they could redeem them for gold at $35 an ounce. But then, that became unreasonable in the 60s again because of war, because of Vietnam. And then Nixon in 1971 decided to go off it completely. We defaulted again on our promise to pay the world, and the dollar devalued dramatically. I think it devalued about 50% against the German mark the first kind of 5 years of the 70s. So, we were able to get the US government and Europe essentially were able to get gold out of the system. So I think those of us in the Bitcoin community have thought a lot about, what would happen if we start trending towards a Bitcoin standard in the future, if central banks start using Bitcoin as a reserve asset, as it becomes bigger and bigger in the world economy. Could the same thing happen? And interested to hear Matthew's thoughts, but we'll go there first. But one important thing about Bitcoin that's important to recognize is that it's not held at the moment in the hands of governments. It's held in the hands of individuals and organizations that are outside of government control, and therefore it can't at the moment at least, it can't befall the same fate as gold did, which does give us some hope, I think, that we could have a different standard. And one thing I'll just say also is that if we did have a Bitcoin standard, it's worth noting that this doesn't necessarily mean that governments won't do a lot of social spending. There's a couple things here, but first of all, if you look at the way the U.S. government is financed today, about 2/3 of it or more is financed by taxes or other revenue streams, but mainly by taxes. And a lot of the entitlements that we have are paid for by taxes. So that wouldn't change regardless of, the money system wouldn't change that. The difference is in what we borrow, is in the difference, right? So, we'd have to think about, as a country, where do we go? What would go off the chopping block first? And I mean, I just could only imagine that these exotic forever wars in faraway places that really don't benefit anybody but military contractors, and certainly don't benefit the average American, may even hurt the average American, certainly hurt the average American who's fighting, that they'd probably be one of the first things to go. And then there would be a negotiation or a triage for other stuff. But I think this idea that if we went back to a fixed monetary standard, it would mean the end of all kind of social spending and social programs is just doesn't make any sense, because a lot of our current social programs already are paid for directly by taxes. So I don't know if, Matthew, you want to react to that, but I was trying to think about, I've been thinking a lot about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, and let's be honest, like this is an enormously complex question that requires kind of making a number of assumptions, and it's important to kind of hedge the confidence we can place on any particular assumption to kind of like go through the chain of reasoning to try to answer the question of to what extent would a Bitcoin standard constrain the physical capacity of nation states to engage in war. And then you have to say, well, what is the extent of that physical constraint, both in terms of the overall budget. Both you could see, net GDP growth means there's just more funding available for all sorts of government spending, and that means if you have a growing economy or a fiscal surplus, I'm sorry, just an economic surplus that the government can capture through taxation, then there's just more resources to appropriate for different purposes, and how those resources get appropriated is sort of somewhat dependent on the political system, right? So we don't know exactly how the political system would evolve and whether people engage in ways that can effectively steer government decisions on how that money is appropriated away from war or war related spending and towards more social spending, right? But I don't think Bitcoin itself is going to have necessarily an explicitly strict constraining effect on that, although you could make certain arguments, right, in the long term. But to the other question about, okay, assume you do have some fiscal constraint, right? There's some more tangible connection between the government's expenditures and the society that it's taking resources from in order to support those expenditures. That sort of a Bitcoin standard, like a gold standard, sort of strengthens that connection, and kind of going through the democratic peace theory logic, then would sort of constrain forms of government expenditure that the society disagrees with, or says, hey, that's a waste of money, or I'm not going to get involved in that. Spend on something that at least benefits me personally. But the other thing I think it's important to recognize is when we say it's a fiscal constraint on war, we have to specify what we mean by war, especially war in the future, because wars in the future are not going to be like the wars in the past. And technology is really showing us where that's going to go. And that, to analyze that question requires making some assumptions about how wars are likely to be fought over what time horizon, and to what extent, automation, AI, drones, cyber technology, synthetic biology, you could, a whole host of things. You look at DARPA's website that they're investing in to try to make war cheaper and more effective. And so just as much as, Bitcoin is sort of naturally aligned with the, Jeff Booth thesis of the sort of technological forces of deflation, that you get more for less, well, that applies to weapons technology. You get more capable weapons for less cost now. I mean, you can see this in things like drones. There are groups now in the Middle East and other parts of the world that can effectively build what amount to cruise missiles with essentially like YouTube tutorials and a few $100s of parts they order online. And that's just going to be a trend you're going to see continue. So yes, like large scale, the war that we're seeing in Ukraine, which involves 150,000, 200,000 people, mechanized divisions, combined arms, big expensive equipment with lots of men that are required to operate it. That as a form of violent conflict is likely to be, say, more expensive. It's not going to get any less expensive, especially as people become more expensive with medical costs and equipment. If you look at the U.S. military's budget, it does not get cheaper, especially things like tanks or F-35s. But there's a big
or medical benefits. Benefits.
Exactly, right? So all these structural incentives for militaries around the world are to move away from manned platforms, large things like aircraft carrier, battle groups, et cetera, and more towards cheaper, more mass-producible, automated capabilities that are also going to be more democratized. So those sorts of instruments of state violence are not necessarily going to just remain within the remit of large, peer, like, U.S. peers. They're going to be increasingly democratized to, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 states and non-state actors. And so this is where I'm a little bit more kind of, I haven't settled my mind on the question of to what extent does Bitcoin solve war, because I think you need to think about, well, what sorts of violent conflict are going to be enabled by this type of technology in the future. And even if Bitcoin acts as a fiscal constraint on nation states, to a certain extent, with other assumptions about how societies choose to sort of, constrain their governments, there's still going to be this sort of overall technology force that's going to make that much more.
What I wanted you to hit on, and I'd love to get Sarah's reaction in a second, and then we're going to open up the conversation and bring some people up and maybe hear some of the folks on stage here. But I guess what I just want to focus the conversation is on this idea of these forever wars. I mean, I don't think, again, that traditional government spending would be really that restricted if it's something that people are into and that they support. It seems likely that, again, they'd be willing to put the blood and treasure in. And I don't know if a monetary standard would change that. I guess the point is that it's really striking today that these kind of very exotic wars that are very irrelevant for the average person, aren't paid for by taxes. They're not paid for by Liberty bonds. They are paid for by borrowing in a super low interest rate environment. And those are the kind of wars that I think you may see less of, regardless of cost, in a future if the financial system is sort of more restrained at the base level. That's, I guess, my working theory at the moment. But I do not think that a more restrained monetary standard would prevent us from going to like a war that our country thought was important. Like, for example, maybe this current thing that we might be getting into here in Ukraine, maybe that's a popular war and maybe that wouldn't be restrained. But man, there's so many wars out there that the Americans just have no idea are even happening. I mean, I don't even know if the three of us, if we just said, like, actually, I'd love to have Sarah say, I mean, Sarah, how many wars have we been in the past decade in your account
Well, it's
by your
like
count?
Matt said, what do we mean by a war? I mean, it's like Obama at the end of his 2 terms said he didn't come into office looking for dragons to slay, but somehow they came after us and he had to go on offense. And again, it to me feels like a chicken and egg problem. Is it? And he acknowledged that war just became too easy. And we've been talking about the financial side, but Matt brings up the issue of drones, and that's the blood part too. If we can just send in some drones and do 500 drone strikes for counterterrorism and declare success and keeping Americans safe, then it's just going to be really tempting to do that. Well, is that a war? I mean, so it gets at one of these questions, or something that also has surfaced in the last few minutes, which is that, the sort of doing more with less. And one of the questions that had come up in my research as I worked on taxing wars was, well, maybe we just don't have, because there was a little bit of this connotation I think people ascribed to my work that was like conspiratorial, that leaders were trying to hide these costs. And they said, well, maybe it's just that these wars are less costly as a percentage of GDP than they used to be. And, that is true, but it's also the case that small wars in the past were fought through war taxes. So, and I think you can't get around the fact that once you shift the way that we're paying for wars, it's also shifting sort of the salience of them for the public. But I do think that if we are going to be fighting what are called these kind of light footprint models of war with drones and cyber, they're not going to be that costly. And so the sort of financial imperative of generating resources for war will also be less. And so I think we'll just kind of end up in these cycles where we're finding these dragons around the world to slay, as Obama had put it. And none of them will amount to something consequential for Americans. But that doesn't mean people aren't dying. So when the U.S. Conducts drone strikes in Yemen or Somalia or in the Middle East, these are still uses of force that have real impact. They're just not as visible in the eyes of the American public because they're not captured by the U.S. media, and they're not captured by the U.S. media because Americans aren't directly affected. So you can see kind of the circularity of these logics.
Yeah, and again, I think that we're talking about maybe the reduction of what we would call imperial or colonial style wars, where like we're going into a region to set up shop and like harvest resources. That seems like it'll still be very expensive. I mean, even in an age of drones, like you still need to like subdue the population, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So look, Putin's war in Ukraine is costing him $20 billion a day. I mean, he's going to run out of money very, very shortly. We'll see what happens. But, America's been paying for these wars in a way that's been unconnected from its population. And, I think most of us agree it's a problem. So we'll have to go from here. I guess we'll open it up. CK, I don't know if anyone who's currently on stage wants to weigh in. I don't know if Odell has thoughts or anyone else. Otherwise, we can just go to get some audience folks up here.
I had a question, and I pinned Sarah's reaction to your article, but one of the last sections, I think we talked about like the decline in democratic peace theory, but one of your last sections was this idea of the Bitcoin peace theory. So I was kind of hoping that maybe you and maybe Sarah and Matt could talk about that a little bit, and then maybe one of the other people on the stage will jump in.
Well, yeah, I mean, my point was simply that if you're on a Bitcoin standard, it's going to be costly to borrow for war. We won't have this ability to do large-scale quantitative easing or yield curve control. This is only possible on a fiat standard. So you can't do this stuff on a, let's say, like a gold standard or on a Bitcoin standard at the same scale. So if we did want to, if we said, okay, we have let's say in 10 years from now, we have $7 trillion coming in through revenue, but our budget's 10 trillion, and we're going to spend a bunch of that on war. That's very possible with today's standard, but anything above what you are bringing in is going to be very costly in a restrained standard. So as to what Sarah was saying, there would be more public debate about it, basically. And then, I just believe that most people are fairly peaceful and try to avoid war when they can. And if more people talk about it, there'd be more incentives to stop it. As she's talking about reading these letters from constituents, like even during World War II, which everybody acknowledges more or less was a just war and we had to do it and all these things, there was still hesitancy. So I really do think you would see more debate about spending, and you would see a higher cost to borrowing. I don't know what the cost to borrowing would be, but it certainly wouldn't be 0% or like 0 point whatever it is, 2%. It would be higher. And it would force harder decisions. And I think that to me is Bitcoin peace theory. It doesn't mean that it's going to end wars. It just means that in a Bitcoin standard, these large scale foreign occupations or unpopular sustained wars would be really hard to do.
I'd love to just jump in here because I think one of the big differences between something like, gold and Bitcoin on the one hand and our current way of paying for wars on the other is the limited supply, the finiteness of Bitcoin or gold versus the limitless supply where if you think about your general equilibrium models in economics, the US can just kind of almost without restraint keep, like you've been saying, Alex, like the low interest rates, sort of artificially low, and just kind of continue just pumping, and without there seeming to be kind of the same impact. And I think it's not to say, as you're suggesting, just like being on the gold standard didn't stop wars from happening, but the fact that there's a finiteness to its supply does create more constraint because there's a more natural equilibrium than between supply and demand than you see, I think, with where we are in our modern economic system.
And one other thing that we haven't touched on yet, and this is a little bit more speculative, but to add to that point is, one difference between Bitcoin and gold is Bitcoin is much more portable. And so, while you can't necessarily entirely escape kind of the, existing governance and social structures that, people embed themselves in, the fact that you can, with Bitcoin, take physical possession of a good chunk of your personal assets in a way that you really just can't just pack up your entire house or your entire Schwab account or your entire retirement fund and just go to another jurisdiction that maybe you feel more politically aligned with. And so there's kind of, in political theory, there's voice and exit, right? And so we talk a lot about the voice side of this, right? Voicing your opinion, through your governance structure to sort of affect the decisions about how that governance system apportions your tax resources and try to steer that away from war. Well, Bitcoin does enable also a form of exit, right, where you can go to a different jurisdiction more easily, right? It doesn't say it eliminates all friction, but it removes a certain source of friction and enables maybe more social and geographic mobility, which also kind of, if you play the game theory out, does impose another kind of constraint on the states that if if they make a bad move, the population's going to take their Bitcoin and leave, right?
It's all about custody, right, Matthew? I mean, how did the U.S. set up the rug pull? The U.S. set up the rug pull by being the custodian, first domestically. We took everybody's gold in 33. This is, 6102, like one of the things that Satoshi Nakamoto was thinking most closely about, obviously, is the fact that we basically were like, in order to pay for the massive expenditures that FDR wanted to do in the 30s, he was like, oh my God, we need to take everybody's gold and give them paper instead. And that's what he did. And it led to a massive devaluation of the dollar. And then we did it again later on the international stage, where we basically took everybody's gold and then we didn't give it back. We instead gave them dollars, and then we said, nope, you can't convert anymore. So, I mean, it was all about the custodial nature of gold in a world where both individuals and other governments don't need the U.S. for custody, or where it's harder for the U.S. or for any superpower to go door to door and take everybody's gold. If it's just math and it can be very easily hidden and it's invisible, that just leads me to believe that that's going to be a lot harder to do. But, this is why we focus so much in the Bitcoin community on, Sarah, this is why there's so much of a focus in the Bitcoin community on self-custody. Like, don't leave your Bitcoin on an exchange. You should custody it yourself, because this actually allows this mechanism to happen. If everybody just uses Bitcoin like a bank and keeps it at an exchange, then this doesn't happen, and Bitcoin could fall the same fate as gold. So the only way that we could ever see if this could work in the future is for us to practice self-custody. So I don't know if, Odell, I feel like that if you're around, maybe if you want to weigh in on that, but I feel like that's the only way we get to see this potential future is if we use it the right way.
Well, I've just been sitting here quietly for the last 70 minutes, and I just want to say that this has been a fantastic conversation. I appreciate everyone that's been a part of it. The overwhelming majority of it has been out of my depth, but just to add on to what Gladstein just said, I mean, that is my perspective. My perspective is essentially the world that I would like to live in, and the world that I think would be a better world, is a world where power is distributed. And how does that happen? That happens through tools that empower individuals and local communities. So I still expect violence to be in that type of world. There's no avoiding that, but I expect that violence to be on a smaller scale with less, massive single power projections like you see, with Russia and Ukraine, or you see with the U.S. and Iraq.
Thanks. So, CK, should we take some, bring some people up, or how do you want to do it?
So if folks want to come up and ask anything, please request, and then I can kind of vet. But would be curious, while folks are kind of waiting to come up, Sarah, what's your take on kind of this idea that potentially Bitcoin as like a global monetary substrate could change these dynamics? A lot of Bitcoiners would say that gold was there, but obviously, it was able to be manipulated by governments, and maybe Bitcoin is different because of its digital nature. I'm kind of curious, coming not necessarily from a super pro Bitcoin position, what's your take on maybe that thesis and maybe its potential for playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty persuaded by the basic thesis, and it seems hard to argue against the merits of distributing power more evenly. One of the questions I have, and this is sort of not really an answer, but a question back, is about the volatility. And so, what do you think this works itself out over time, where you don't get these 5 to 10% swings on a daily basis? Because that would seem to be something that might make this, the lack of stability would seem to be something that would be a consideration.
Yeah, I mean, two quick answers. One would be you're watching something monetize from zero. There's a great article I'd recommend people read called Wittgenstein's Money by Alan Farrington, where he talks about this, like what would happen if a global neutral open money was going to monetize from zero, right? You have to think about just put your like just critical cap aside just for a second, and just open your of open yourself to the possibility of what that would look like. And what it would look like would be very volatile. Gold took thousands of years for humans to kind of settle on it as the monetary standard, and it took a very long time for it to get where it is today. We're talking about compressing that into a couple decades. The other thing so look, I think most people here would admit that it's going to be a wild ride, but over time it goes in a particular direction, and that's the opposite of the fiat currencies. Like it's going, I mean, a lot of, you look, Sarah, at the price, and a lot of people freak out anytime it drops, but the fact is the price of Bitcoin in dollar terms is up 4x in 18 months, and it's up 40x in 5 years. And I think people forget that. And where's it going to be in 18 months from now, and where's it going to be in 5 years from now? No one knows. Anyone who tells you they know is lying. But certainly over the next decade, it's going to get extremely valuable given monetary conditions around the world, and the fact that it's the only digital asset that that has a monetary policy that's fixed. Every other digital asset, whether it be made by a government or another cryptocurrency company, can change the rules. They can make more if they need to. Bitcoin's the only thing that's designed in a way that it can't be made more of. So it points to like a future where it gets more valuable. It's just going to be quite volatile. One thing I would say, though, is that over the next few years, you're going to see people, I think, figure out how to, if you hold Bitcoin, how to basically, as a holder of Bitcoin, peg your Bitcoin value to other things through smart contracts, whether that be maybe the dollar or gold or oil or God knows what. So I think there's going to be more flexibility in the future. So not only will you see, maybe the volatility continue, but I think there'll be ways for holders of Bitcoin to hedge that risk in a variety of ways. But I think really just to conclude the moment we're living in right now, where not only did you see on the micro scale in Canada, a liberal democratic government, so to speak, freezing the bank accounts of people it didn't agree with, like regardless of whether or not you supported the protesters. This should be super alarming. And that just brings to our attention that, if you don't control your money, it's not yours. And now we have it at the geopolitical level, right? Both with Afghanistan, where their money's been frozen by us, and where all of a sudden half of Russia's $1 trillion was in U.S. securities, et cetera, and those were frozen too. And now you've got China sitting with $1 trillion of of treasuries, realizing that it's not theirs. This whole debate over like inside money versus outside money. So to me, the volatility of the dollar price is part of the story, but it's also the fact that Bitcoin is the only digital outside money in the world. You can have gold, but gold can't teleport. It's got to sit in a basement in Moscow, and that very much limits its basically its utility, essentially. So you're going into a world where there's only one outside digital money. I think it's just going to get extremely valuable. So I hope that helps. But I mean, you could talk for weeks about this topic, certainly.
Yeah, I was just going to add, it's in my mind, it's very simply a matter of uncertainty, right? Volatility is a function of uncertainty, right? So right now, the market is very uncertain about the future value of Bitcoin. So you see wide price fluctuations, right? If by assumption you get to a future where the global market is less uncertain about the future price of Bitcoin, you'll just have less volatility. And so as you get to more and more adoption, the sort of consensus about its future uncertainty becomes less and less, which reflects sort of less volatility in the price. So that's just kind of a natural function for any asset, let alone Bitcoin, just kind of the market's collective future assessment of its uncertainty.
I'd love to present a question to Alex, Sarah, and Matt. Just more broadly, a lot of this conversation has been rooted around how we have funded wars, especially since post-World War II. I'm curious, though, on your thoughts. It feels like, especially, Alex, in your article that you wrote, a lot of your conversation was around the post-9/11 wars. I myself feel like a lot of those wars were fought over control over oil, i.e. control over energy. If a lot of us in the Bitcoin community view Bitcoin as the purest form of energy, at what point do you see a potential for war over the control of Bitcoin, and what does that look like?
No, it's a great question, and just I'm trying to unpack this for Sarah because she probably doesn't hang out in Bitcoin spaces all the time. What he's hinting at, and again, great question, is that to produce Bitcoin, you have to mine it with electricity. So you have massive amounts of Bitcoin mining infrastructure across the world in different countries located at whether it be hydropower, solar, wind, natural gas fields, etc. So currently, this is a pretty distributed setup. This was massively aided by the fact that the CCP essentially kind of cracked down on mining about 10 months ago. Previous to that, most of the mining infrastructure was located within the CCP's territory, not anymore. So now it's like pretty distributed around the world. So I guess he's hinting at that if the US was, willing to go to certain, like, let's put the why did we go to the Iraq war aside for a second. If governments clearly over history have been willing to go to war over resources, then why would they not also go to resources war over Bitcoin mining resources? I think Matthew's well equipped to probably maybe answer that, but my general sense is that I don't know if there would be such a reason because energy's all around us, and I don't know if it's all like Bitcoin miners are only going to use the cheapest energy they can find, and I'm not sure that like invading a country makes that energy cheaper. Like if you're going to fight a war to claim some sort of resource, it's probably going to make that energy more expensive. This actually happened when we invaded Iraq, like, which is one of the reasons I don't think we invaded Iraq for oil by itself, is that it destroyed all the oil fields. It was war. Everything got blown up. And then, the price, it didn't necessarily get cheaper. So Bitcoin miners want the cheapest thing possible. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic than oil, where the oil producers actually want the most, they don't mind if it's very expensive, as we're seeing now. So anyway, Matthew, thoughts on that?
Yeah, and this is a question, if we're hypothesizing about the future where Bitcoin, something like a Bitcoin standard exists, or at least where Bitcoin mining and the Bitcoin kind of overall value is sort of strategically important, right? Now, you could imagine different ways in which sort of formal government entities, engage with the network in various ways, but sort of by hypothesis, it's really important, right? So the nation state has an interest in it in some fashion, and an interest in, say, protecting it, right? Especially if it's if its value is important for the global for its economy. The Bitcoin network really touches the physical world, in the most important respect through mining, right? And so that's where kind of the political exposure or the political implications of the network kind of are most acute. And so and that's sort of an open question. All right. So where principally does mining congregate geographically is I think an unknown in the future. To what extent is sort of the ownership of those resources concentrated in certain political jurisdictions? To what extent does different energy generation technology that gets incentivized by Bitcoin mining sort of either facilitate more distribution or more concentration? You could go both ways, right? You could imagine massive solar wind farms that are owned by big conglomerates. You can imagine more natural gas flaring that's all distributed, or small modular nuclear reactors that are all kind of in different spots of the world. Again, the sort of concentration of energy and associated mining, is the kind of intersection of the Bitcoin network with kind of political jurisdictions, and therefore kind of the security interests of the states in which they exist. The other key intersection is going to be, and this is the most acute right now, which is microchip fabrication, right? This is like, one, maybe two foundries on the planet that make sort of the chips that are kind of the state of the art for Bitcoin mining, as well as other consumer electronics. It's an extremely advanced, probably the most advanced technology human beings have, and it's mostly in Taiwan or South Korea. And so there's other strategic reasons the United States has an interest in sort of reshoring chip fabrication, because it's important for defense production, military systems. But I think as if by hypothesis Bitcoin becomes strategically important and just very, very large, the interests of Bitcoin participants is going to be to have as much sort of vertical control over their chip fabrication, their energy resources, et cetera. But the last point I also made is that Bitcoin mining, to Alex's point, it's an intensely competitive, almost perfectly competitive market, in the sense that right now there's only 6.25 Bitcoin every roughly 10 minutes that gets issued by the network, and essentially is whoever has the most hash power has like the probabilistically best chance of getting that block reward. And so everyone's basically putting different sizes of straws into that pot of new Bitcoin, and so shrinking someone else's straw sort of gets you more of it. And so there is an incentive for all the mining participants on the network to make their straw bigger, make someone else's straw smaller. And so that could, you can imagine a future in which, one mining company tries to, sabotage or cyber attack some other mining company to turn off their machines. There's all sorts of hypothetical dynamics you could play that out. But the very nature of the Bitcoin mining network is that someone else's loss is someone else's gain, but it isn't your gain individually, right? So essentially, you can't really steal that other person's block reward. You just sort of probabilistically increase the chances of maybe you getting it, and over time maybe increasing your relative share. So hard to say whether that would drive as much discrete violence, because you're not like seizing something of tangible value, right? But again, all hypothetical. But that's to say that mining is probably going to be the principal place where you see that type of intersection between states and physical geographies and potential sources of conflict.
Maybe the next question. Or Sarah, did you want to weigh in?
Well, no, I think it's a really important point to hit on, which is to we talk about this as kind of not tied to a government, not tied to a jurisdiction kind of thing, but I don't think we should underestimate the power of central governments, even in something like this. It's so decentralized, and we've been talking about kind of physical location of mining. But one of the things I think we're seeing hinted at here too, with the Russian sanctions and crypto exchanges, is that these exchanges are physically based, have some residence, and there is this threat by, for example, U.S. lawmakers about the role of these exchanges in enabling the Russian invasion and oligarchs. And so you can see some dance going on between kind of the words and actions on the part of these crypto exchanges that I think are meant to kind of self-preserve for the long term, so they're not over-regulated. But you can see even there kind of the locusts that are hovering around, on both sides of the aisle, Senator Warren, Senator Graham, on trying to use this as an opportunity to regulate, and these crypto exchanges trying to anticipate and deflect that energy behind regulation by trying to do a dance where they're not seen as enabling Russia, but trying to protect their image as a kind of more better distribution of power without being tied to either a physical government or a physical location.
Yeah, it's a great point. Do we want to take Pedro here?
Yeah.
Or...
So yeah, one last question from Pedro, and then we can close this one out. Pedro, you have the mic.
All right, thank you guys. Hi, I just wanted to give some thoughts on like what Bitcoin is to me. Bitcoin to me is freedom of speech, and I'm pretty sure that resonates with a lot of people. And since it's the First Amendment being freedom of speech and freedom of religion, since Bitcoin is code, does that imply that Bitcoin cannot be made illegal in a sense? And I'm sure that it could or it could not be made legal, because at the end of the day, everything's like a decision by somebody or many people per se, and Bitcoin is just revolutionary. It's a 24/7 operating bank which has instant settlement, which is like
Wait,
cash.
quick question, Pedro. Do you have a question?
Yes, my question was that is Bitcoin freedom of speech, which implies that it's protected by the U.S. government or the laws. So I'm just wondering if that applies to that.
I mean, my take is they could definitely ban it. I mean, they banned gold, which was seen as morally, over centuries and millennia, a safe and sound tool to store money in. So they could try to pass laws banning it. Those laws would not work. They'd be very costly, and it'd be very unpopular given that north of 50 million Americans now own Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. So I think we're kind of past the horizon of a total ban in a country like ours, at least. But look, they tried to ban it in all kinds of dictatorships in other countries. Again, it doesn't work. It's like the Streisand effect. They come out on TV and they say, we're banning it. And then everybody's like, wait, what are they trying to ban? This new form of money that they can't control? Sign me up. So it's like you see rocketing, adoption in places like India and Nigeria where governments have tried to ban it. And like in China, it's, the Chinese government's tried, it's like a running joke in the Bitcoin community, Sarah, about like how many times has the Chinese government tried to ban Bitcoin? It's like 15, 16, 17 times, who knows? Obviously, that means they can't ban it. So I think there's different incentives here, Pedro, but like, I don't know if Matthew wants to win, but my general thoughts have always been that like it's going to be very hard to ban this thing, and it's very costly. And there's more incentives for governments to actually adopt it than to ban it. But that's just my take.
Yeah, I mean, on the technical matter, Bitcoin's regulated as commodity and property, right? And so like posting code is protected speech, but the sort of financial activity that you engage in when you go to an exchange, you exchange some money for Bitcoin. That's at least in the U.S. They have the jurisprudence to sort of claim that as within their remit, right? But I think the broader point is, I just don't necessarily think that there is an inevitable opposition, right? I mean, it could go either way, right? I think that's one of the objectives we have at the Bitcoin Policy Institute is to try to shape it in a more positive way. That there is a story here that Bitcoin is good for America and Americans, and I don't think this is sort of natural or inevitable opposition. It's possible. Things evolve, bad things happen. Certain politicians can sort of take the mantle and be really, aggressive against Bitcoin and sort of hurt their constituents. But I also think there's, growing recognition among policymakers and regulators that, Bitcoin is, at least neutral. And some folks are waking up to the fact that it might actually be a net positive. But that's a story that it's up to Bitcoiners to tell, right? And it's obviously not obvious to us. It takes a long time to sort of understand Bitcoin itself, and then trying to understand what Bitcoin means for the United States and various interests is another complicated story to tell. So I think it's just incumbent on us to sort of tell that story, sort of make the case that it is good for America and Americans and other people around the world. And it should be let it do its thing.
Well, I'd love to close out and get some concluding thoughts from Sarah. But one thing I would say is that it's very telling that Bitcoin was not part of Putin's plan. I mean, he obviously planned this invasion for a long time, like thought about it carefully, stockpiled a lot of gold. Seems like he was counting on more cooperation with Chinese payment systems as well, is doing more things internally with internal payment systems, is trying to sell oil and gas. But it's quite clear that Bitcoin was not part of the plan. And I think that that's very telling because at the end of the day, when you look at the CCP's actions towards Bitcoin, you look at Russia's, non-use of it at a time when it probably could have been very useful. And I think that these governments that are tyrannical are not very comfortable with Bitcoin. I think they see that their opposition is using it. Alexei Navalny, who's currently sitting in a prison in Russia, raised millions of dollars in Bitcoin, and it was the only way he could do it because his legacy financial accounts were monitored and frozen off and on, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that they're uncomfortable with something they don't control. So I think there's something interesting happening there. And I think that a free society has nothing to fear from Bitcoin. So it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds. The last thing I would just say before giving it to Sarah to conclude would be, this idea that's very popular in the United States lately of modern monetary theory. Look, I would recommend people actually read Stephanie Kelton's book to get a sense of what these people believe in. And it was so fascinating to see that the words Iraq and Afghanistan didn't appear in her book. So there's a lot of talk about expansionary domestic spending and the fact that we don't need, like if we're issuing the currency that we owe our debts in, then we don't need to have a debt limit or whatever. Like we can just keep printing until we get inflation. Like, so that's sort of the theory, but it's interesting that they just never talk about foreign policy. They never talk about war making. And I just wonder why. And it's just been something that's very curious to me. And regardless of whether or not they are for these forever wars, they're certainly not opposing them. And at the end of Kelton's book, she actually says that we should be proud of the wars that we fought on our debt, which I thought was a shocking statement that reminded me of basically like imperial hubris or something. But I don't know. They haven't come out and opposed to the credit card wars. So very interesting to see where the MMTers land on this. And that's something else I'm thinking about. But anyway, Sarah, we'll hear what you have to say here, and then we'll close it out.
Yeah, well, no, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I think that these forums are really the exception rather than the rule in terms of kind of the interdisciplinarity, where people who understand economics also understand foreign policy and vice versa. But usually those are just two different silos that don't communicate with each other. And so I think more of these conversations need to take place where we're talking about the way in which these exchanges of Bitcoin can affect and be a way, an alternative to some of these systems that we've kind of taken for granted as the only way. And I do sort of think that the kind of organic response to a system that feels kind of overregulated probably makes a lot of sense. And we're still kind of coming to terms with the implications of what that means. And I think this is one of these first conflicts where we can see the way in which, this might provide an alternative, and that it can be a way where we can kind of constrain actors that are autocratic. And I mean, to this point too, about the politics of this within the US, I think the more that countries that are autocratic kind of try to move against Bitcoin, the harder in a way it will be for countries like the United States to do that, because they're going to look like they're on the wrong side of this issue. So no, I would just vote for more conversations like this so we can keep moving forward on understanding the implications of this really important thing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, Sarah. Everybody, her book is called Taxing Wars, The American Way of War Finance and the Decline of Democracy. I would highly recommend that you read it. Thanks also to Matthew for lending his insights, and thank you, CK, for hosting this, and to Bitcoin Mag. It's been great. Appreciate it.
Everyone, go read Alex's article. It's pinned to the top. It's the second article in the Nest. And see you at Bitcoin 2022. Less than 30 days. So
oh yeah,
be in Miami. It's going to be a great time. So looking forward to it. I think promo code Satoshi, save yourself 10% off paying Bitcoin. We give a discount for that as well. So see you everyone in Miami. Thanks again, Alex. Thanks again, Sarah. Thank you, Matthew.